Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Yvonne Castillo, and I'm the Director of Risk Management at Victor. So glad that you could join us today. This program, Unlocking Your Firm's ESG Potential with Victor's ESG Risk Rating tool, has been approved for credit through the American Institute of Architects as a live presentation. I have a couple of logistical slides I need to get through before we begin, so bear with me. Here's the official course number for reference. We are recording as well, and we'll have a link on our website if you want to go back and watch or if you want to share it with your colleagues. For today's live program, you will get 1 hour of health, safety, welfare credit through the AIA, but again, it's only for the live program. And then in terms of continuing education, you're going to get, after the webinar, you're going to get a survey link. And if you are a Victor CNA policyholder, and you are also a member of the American Institute of Architects, we will report for you on your behalf your completion of this program. But please do give us your AIA number in the survey link so that we can do so. Regardless, everyone who's on this call will receive a certificate of attendance about an hour after the webinar. Okay, so with that, I think we've got the logistics out of the way so we can go ahead and get started with the program. All right, so we're going to be together today for about an hour. Here's the agenda for the day, and I'm going to break this up into 3 parts. So the first part, we're going to just sort of level set and talk about just the very basics of environmental, social, and governance. We're going to talk about the ESG risk factors. So what do the factors look like? What's driving ESG and how it's impacting the economy or industries specifically. And then we'll move on and we're going to talk about the design industry. So that's the second part of this program. And I do want to caution you that I know probably the second part is why everybody's here. A lot of design firms are on this call, but it's really important that you listen in on the first part because my plan is to build on what we're learning through the program. So we'll start with the basics, move on to impacts specifically for design firms and connect the dots for you. And then I'm going to close with unveiling the new ESG risk rating tool. We're super excited about this. We've been working on this for about a year now, so very excited to be able to show this to our insureds. I'm going to show you how it works, its features, the benefits, and basically why design firms will want to use this to assess your corporate ESG performance. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and get started. All right, first, starting with the basics. So, of course, the very basics is that ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance, and it's a sustainable investment strategy. This means that investors are looking at longer-term risk considerations related to environmental, societal, and governance risks. And they're doing this by integrating internationally and nationally accepted performance standards in those evaluations. And usually that comes in the form of an ESG risk rating. We're going to talk about all of that through this program. But first, let's focus in on the basics, and that is, what are the ESG risk factors and what do they look like? So on this slide, you can see there are a laundry list of issues that fall within each of the categories of environment, social, and governance. It's a lot here on this slide, and so we're going to unpack this piece by piece. Let's start first with the environmental issues that fall into ESG. And keep in mind, this is not a comprehensive list of all the environmental issues. I'm just hitting on the high points because I just want you to have a better sense of the scope and breadth of ESG risk factors. So let's look at environmental issues first. So of course, everyone on this call probably knows climate crisis, climate change, that is a major issue in ESG investing. Investors are paying very close attention to climate risks because there are so many risks related to climate change. There are physical risks, transition risks, and reputational risks. So let's talk about that for a second. So physical risks, this is kind of obvious, but the physical risks of climate change are severe weather events. and the weather events that result specifically in significant losses and liabilities. These risks are increasing in severity and frequency. Just last year in the United States, there were 18 separate climate disaster events where the losses for each of those events exceeded $1 billion. Transition risks. So these relate to the businesses being unable to comply with new regulations or remain competitive in the face of changes in regulations or policy. We're going to talk a little bit more later about what those changes are and what's happening, but there is a lot of change, especially in the last 2 years. And frankly, it's difficult to keep up with, even if you're following it. So we'll touch on that. Reputational risks, this is probably the most obvious, but reputational risks are those risks that arise from potential harm to a company's reputation. And these are caused by negative publicity, negative public perception, customer complaints or client complaints, or behavior by employees or company executives. And environmental disasters, for example, or as I said earlier, they are happening more frequently. And when they do, given the urgency around climate change and global warming, it's not only terrible for the planet and the people living here, but it's very bad for business. And investors just want to stay clear of that. Biodiversity loss, another big area aside from climate change. So a couple of little factoids just to give you a sense of what's going on here. According to the World Wildlife Fund, wildlife populations have declined by 69% just in the last 50 years. So in 50 years, we're talking about 3/4 of wildlife populations in decline. And deforestation is part of that as well. Just in the past 13 years, so we're talking about a little over a decade, in the tropics and subtropics, it is estimated to be the size of California. So these declines in biodiversity are concerning to investors for many reasons, but some of the more basic reasons relate to disruptions in important ecosystems, the Earth's ability to absorb carbon, which of course is causing global warming, the ability to sustain the planet and the people here through food supplies and disruptions in food supplies. And the biodiversity declines that I'm talking about are also associated with increased infectious diseases, which impacts the workforce, which impacts business continuity, as we have all experienced through COVID. There are other risk factors here on this slide. I included resource constraints. So, the war in Ukraine, of course, has caused some very troubling energy resource constraints, water constraints in certain parts of the world, in certain parts of the United States, mineral constraints. This is particularly important right now to investors as we transition the economy, and there's going to be more use of battery technology and other technologies. Building materials, of course, I know you all are very familiar with some of the resource constraints there. And then I've also included pollution, air, both air and water, and solid waste, generation of solid waste. So hopefully that gives you a flavor for the scope and breadth of issues that fall under the E within ESG risk. All right, let's move on to social issues, because this is the one that I think a lot of people may not be as aware of. So talent scarcity, top of the list here, not necessarily in priority order, but a very, very big risk factor within the social bucket of ESG. So some of you may have heard of a group called Adecco Group. This is a leading global talent advisory company. And just recently, last year, they basically made an announcement that talent scarcity is here to stay, which was sort of surprising to many of us, because I think there was this general assumption that after COVID, the economy would bounce back, people would come back to work. Well, unfortunately, they're saying, no, this is our foreseeable future, because demographics have shifted. And so employers are having to resign to that fact in this post-pandemic world and really shift their strategies for talent. So things like, and I've listed here, upskilling the workforce, current talent, training the workforce in skills for the future. That's another really important social issue. Moving on, Social unrest, that's another big risk factor within ESG. So whether we're talking about social unrest at the global level or the national level or community level, the global business community recognizes that when a lot of people are unhappy, things like boycotts, riots, strikes, or just bad press, a bad opinion piece or a bad article, all of these things have negative impacts on business and can hurt a company's profits and a company's reputation. Workforce safety, very big issue in our line of business, of course, design and construction industry. So we'll talk more about that later. I can show you some of those issues. Cybersecurity breaches falls under the S within ESG. Of course, we're all seeing more risks there. Human rights and child labor abuses are other important social risk factors within ESG. Where materials and labor are being sourced is increasingly a matter of importance for investors. Supply chain vulnerabilities is another risk factor in the S category, but frankly, it also falls under the E category. As we know, climate disruptions impact supply chain. Investors are looking more closely at the resiliency of businesses, by the way. They're looking to see how resilient are your supply chains. How do you procure your materials, things that are essential to your line of business? So supply chain vulnerabilities are very important. How companies manage and communicate with the communities they work in. I know many of you are familiar with that when you're working on projects. And then the last bucket here, ethics, compliance, and corruption. So this is a risk factor because the best way I can put this is companies that don't follow rules or engage in dishonest or corrupt practices, eventually they get into trouble, which could mean reputational risks and loss in profits. And that is something that investors simply want to avoid. So let's move on to governance. Governance is part of ESG because it looks to understand what controls are in place, what reporting standards and resiliency measures a company has in place to mitigate those E and S risk factors. So everything we just talked about. G is the risk management of environmental and social risks. You can see here on the slide, just to kind of piece this out a little bit, controls are things like practices that companies have, procedures, policies, quality controls, and all of these things that a company might have in place to, number one, comply with laws and regulations, but also to keep up with industry best practice. Reporting frameworks. So in the US, we're in a voluntary regime on ESG. That could change. The SEC, as many of you all know, has a pending climate disclosure rule and a number of other ESG rules that are pending. So that could change. There are thousands of firms already in the US that are voluntarily reporting on ESG, but in other countries, there are mandatory performance requirements, or disclosure requirements. So how a company, or whether a company is reporting and being transparent to its project stakeholders on how it performs on ESG, that's another important metric. Resiliency. Okay, everybody knows what that means, but really this is when you're thinking about it in terms of performance to ESG, it's about how companies are strategically managing ESG risks today and how they're planning for those risks in the future. So how to be resilient in the future. And there's specific performance metrics around that. We'll talk about that. Okay. So now that we've discussed ESG risk factors broadly, let's talk about what is driving financial institutions to look more closely at these ESG risks. Okay, at a high level, there is a general recognition that the old way of assessing financial risk in investing, underwriting, and lending just isn't good enough anymore. There is too much uncertainty in the market, too many disruptive forces in today's market to do what we've always been doing. And the other important backdrop on this slide is that there's also general recognition by financial institutions that they can no longer count on the US federal government to fix some of the systemic challenges around ESG. It's just not a good strategy anymore. And financial institutions, frankly, are now saying, this is why we're seeing this momentum on ESG. They're basically saying, we're going to have to step in. We've got to manage these financial risks. We can no longer leave it strictly up to the policy world to manage some of these risks, because there are real financial risks we're experiencing right now. It's sort of like a light bulb has kind of gone off. Financial risk assessment simply requires more rigor to account for the emerging and future risks. So what does more rigor look like? My attempt to graphically depict that is in this slide. Traditional investing and lending and underwriting models usually just look at financial statements. So we're talking about profit and loss statements, balance sheets, income statements, cash flow statements. And this is a narrow analysis of financial risk in this world. It just gives a snapshot of a company in a given window of time. It doesn't tell investors, underwriters, or lenders much about the future profitability outlook of a company. So now financial institutions are pivoting to a broader way of looking at risk, and that includes environmental risk factors, social risk factors, and governance factors. So all the things that we've just been discussing, a much broader look at financial risk. Now, you might look at this diagram and think, wow, that is a very different and much broader way to look at risk. And you are right. This is why, and this is the reason that is driving so much consternation in some policy arenas in certain states. Just a small handful, but certain policy arenas, as you know in the news, are concerned about that. And the reality is this is a paradigm shift that's going to impact industry. And in the long run, it's going to be a more meaningful analysis to have for financial institutions to take this broader view. But in the short run, companies that don't want change, they're not adaptable, they are going to be very vocal in opposition, as will their lobbyists. So I guess my point in sharing this is that while our economy is going through this transition, there is going to be, in the next few years, there's going to be a lot of ups and downs, but I'm confident that we're going to stay the course. ESG is a business imperative. It's not a trend, and a fundamental shift in how companies operate and create value in the 21st century is happening. A good metaphor that helped me early in my ESG journey when I was trying to learn about ESG is this. It's sort of thinking about it as a peek under the hood. It gives financial institutions a deeper look at a company's long-term risk profile. You can think of the car frame in this image as the financial statements of a company. Maybe it looks good on the outside, right? But what's going on inside? Maybe it's a lemon. ESG risk data is telling financial institutions a deeper story about a company. It's going to tell financial institutions whether a company is compromising its long-term financial outlook, or on the other hand, a much more positive way of looking at this, it could reveal that a company is more competitive in the market and is uniquely positioned in a changing world. So in other words, if financial institutions aren't looking more deeply when they invest, underwrite, or lend, here's what's at stake. 3 things: liability risks. So these are the lawsuits and claims related to ESG issues. Business risks, because companies that aren't looking up to see what's coming, like changes in demand for goods and services, all those regulatory and policy changes that are happening, these companies may become less competitive down the road. Some of them may even become obsolete. Reputational risks, lawsuits, claims, public allegations of some wrongful conduct or compliance issues, all of these issues can compromise a business's reputation and profits. So what's at stake without a deeper look? As I indicated here on the slide, heightened risks threaten financial performance. So now that we've reviewed ESG risks broadly and why financial institutions care about these issues, let's look at how financial institutions are taking these risk factors into account. One way is through the use of ESG risk rating tools. If you don't know what those are, that's totally fine. That's why we're here today. Risk rating tools give financial institutions the ability to compare and contrast companies with standardized performance scores or ratings. So on this slide, you can see just a quick overview of the elements of an ESG risk rating tool. So the first thing, data collection. It depends on the model that's out there. There are many, but things like emissions, greenhouse gas emissions of a company, energy use, waste reduction practices, your labor practices. How are you upskilling your workforce? How are you treating your employees? All of the things we talked about, plus your governance procedures. So all those data points, depending again on the model, are in these ESG risk rating tools. And what the tools do is they extract that data, take the data, and then they analyze it with their own algorithms or models, and then it spits out a performance score or a rating. And it factors in usually the industry in which that company is actually performing in. And we'll talk more about how that works. But first, so think of ESG risk rating like a credit rating. But instead of rating the ability of an organization to fulfill some sort of financial commitment, like paying back a loan or other financial commitments like credit ratings do, ESG risk ratings tell a story of a company's ability to be resilient to economic, environmental, social shocks, and also the ability of a company to be able to thrive through those disruptions. So the higher the ESG rating or score, the more sustainable the company may be viewed in terms of long-term profitability. So the challenge for financial or for privately held companies is that access to these ESG risk rating agencies and research firms like, you may have heard of MSCI, S&P, Sustainalytics, ISS, access can be very limited. It costs a lot of money generally, and usually large publicly traded companies are better positioned in the market to invest in getting an ESG performance rating or score. This is one of the reasons why we decided we wanted to launch the Victor ESG Risk Rating tool. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But first, I promised you I would talk about the design industry. So we're going to talk about that before we get to ESG, our ESG risk rating tool. Okay. So why should design firms care about ESG? What I've said so far, it may give you the impression that ESG risks are problems for financial institutions and not the design industry. And at a high level, yes, ESG started with financial institutions, but it is an important way to think about this is that financial institutions are the backbone of our economy, right? And when transformational change is happening in the backbone of our economy, it is impacting everything. Transformational change will happen in all industries, including the design industry. The transformation that is afoot is and will trigger the need for design firms to, number one, exercise more scrutiny on business models and strategies. Number two, more scrutiny on project designs and execution. And also the third is a greater need to manage proactively your ESG risks, as well as your clients. Again, we'll talk about that too. All right, so here are some reasons why design firms need to be thinking about ESG risks. So one of the top reasons here at the top is improving your project profiles. So it goes without saying, all projects require funding, they require financing and insurance. And as a stakeholder, what you do and how you perform on ESG matters. There will be more projects involving things like green bonds, social bonds, or sustainability bonds. And all of these require more rigorous proof of sustainability outcomes and other positive social outcomes. Now, the other piece to this, I referenced it earlier about federal funding or federal legislative packages. Just in the last 2 years, we saw the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, it's also called that. And then also, and that was in the spring of 21, then we saw the Inflation Reduction Act. In Washington circles, it's called the Climate Bill, and that just passed in November. These are historic hallmark pieces of legislation that provide a profusion of federal funding for projects. And all of that, or most all of that funding has strings attached for good ESG outcomes. Things like climate change mitigation, adaptation, resiliency in communities, equity and safety. All of those things we've been talking about, those are the strings attached to this federal funding. So the big picture I want you to take away from this is, and what you should understand is that projects that have good ESG aligned goals are going to attract more favorable financing on the private side and more project flows on the public side. Or in the case, for those of you who are involved in public-private partnerships, there's going to be a little bit of both. Also, you should consider, before we move on, you may be asked about your company's ESG performance. How are you going to respond if you haven't measured it, you don't know how you measure against the ESG risk factors, or you don't fully understand what the scope is? Also, you may see contract provisions requiring you to comply to an owner's ESG performance supplier standard. We're starting to see that already. We're tracking that trend. And again, how do you comply if you don't know what the scope of those requirements are? Another quick aside before moving on to the second point here is, how many times have you tried to pitch to a client or owner the idea of integrating sustainability measures or resiliency measures into a project? And what you were met with was not only reluctance, but a client ultimately saying, I'm not going to invest in that. I don't want to spend the money, right? I can easily imagine that ESG is going to positively influence that dynamic if it hasn't already, if you aren't already seeing that. In other words, for those of you on this webinar who are pushing sustainability and resilience, your job may be getting easier in the near future. Competitive edge, that's the next bullet here. So ESG management is growing and performance expectations are becoming standardized. There is momentum behind global standardization for reporting and disclosing on ESG performance. So acting now, getting your business in order, your ducks in a row, is going to help you get ahead. Reducing claims, the third bullet here. ESG is about managing emerging and future risks, and a company that is proactively managing these risks is going to be better positioned to reduce claims exposure. I'm going to show you a slide in a little bit more to give you a better flavor for that, but there is no doubt when you look at the ESG risk rating tool that we've just launched, it is a rigorous assessment. We make no qualms about it. It's rigorous assessment of risks. So you will see quite easily, if you have a high ESG risk score, you will have a reduced exposure to claims. Attracting talent. So companies with a robust ESG record tend to have stronger corporate brand value, and of course, that's going to attract talent. And as all of you know, good talent helps you deliver top quality services, and delivering top quality services is going to mean profits and a steady pipeline of business and growth. The last piece here, protecting health, safety, and welfare. So design professionals who are on this call, you have a unique role in ESG. By virtue of your license, you have an obligation to protect the public's health, safety, and welfare already. And while protecting the public's health, safety, and welfare has always taken into account some level of environmental and social risks, we live in a different time now, and those risks are increased and much greater. So the more awareness you have as a firm about ESG risks and the associated opportunities, the better the public will be served in all aspects of health, safety, and wellness. And on that last note, I do empathize. I realize you don't have an easy job of protecting the public's health, safety, and welfare. You probably think it's a moving target, and you're not wrong. Since the pandemic, there have been a rapid succession of crises connected to ESG, and they are all telling us that we live in a world of constant global transformation. All of these crises that are happening at once impact the design and construction market. You're seeing it in supply chain uncertainties, labor and talent shortages, increased costs of building materials, a demand, and there's going to be growth in demand for low carbon materials and new construction methodologies. And this flurry of constant change and uncertainty means that your firm has to be ready to adapt all the time. And many of you are adapting already by ramping up your sustainable design practice and your services in recognition of that demand. And that's a very smart thing to do, but that's only part of a good strategy. Managing your corporate ESG profile and aligning the way you run your business in accordance with good ESG practice is another component for adapting to a world of constant transformation. So in other words, your optimal strategy is going to be twofold. And the question is, where do you start? How do you navigate this two-part strategy? Well, that's where Victor's ESG Risk Rating tool comes in. We believe that it can be your compass to help you navigate all of this transformation and all the challenges that are afoot. It's going to help inform your sustainable practice. It's going to also help you align your corporate performance. So let's talk through that a little bit. Okay, so Victor's ESG Risk Rating tool, very excited to be able to provide this to our insureds. What is it? How does it work? And why might you want to take advantage of it? So fundamentally, it is a self-assessment tool, and it's a self-assessment tool on ESG risk factors. It's free. Again, if you're in the CNA, if you're a Victor CNA policyholder, it is free to you and free to you on a repeat basis. And I'll talk about that in a second. The tool is first going to help you measure how your company or your firm is measuring up against the risk factors. And then by understanding how you're measuring up, of course, it's going to help you manage those risks. You'll have to assess for yourself whether or not you have the resources, the capacity to improve performance. But by understanding how you're performing, you can then manage those risks. And then lastly, it gives you a great scorecard that you can then use to communicate with others, with all your project stakeholders or clients or customers. It gives you a nice scorecard. It's a really graphically nice one-page scorecard on your corporate ESG performance. You don't have to share it, of course, but it gives you that, and it's automatic. Within 24 to 48 hours of you self-assessing your firm, you will get your scorecard, and you can do with it whatever you want to do. We'll talk about that. So first, foundationally, it's important to know that the questions are based on many international and nationally recognized standards. Here are some of those standards. I put a check mark next to the ones that are more well-known here in the United States. But performance standards like the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosures, known as TCFD, Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, the SASB, and the Global Reporting Initiative. And the reason this is important is that I want you to know that our tool aligns with market-leading ESG third-party data providers such as S&P, MSCI, Sustainalytics, the ones I was talking to you about earlier. So it's a credible scorecard. So let's talk about some of the questions and some of the formats. So first up, the question format is going to be simple. Most are going to require you to answer with a yes or no answer. Some of them are multiple choice and are going to require a numerical value. There is no need in any of this process to provide any documentation. And the reason is it's a self-assessment tool. This is for you. It is not for Victor. It is not for anyone, actually, unless you want to share it. So that's important. Now, that said, you may want to have some documentation as you're going through the assessment. We'll talk about that in a second, but you need not provide anything in this self-assessment. Okay, I wanted to focus in on question 5 for a moment. So early on in your assessment, you're going to be asked to select the industry of your organization. You're going to get a drop-down menu like this on the screen where you can select from 69 different industries. These are the global industry classification standards. And most of you are going to select professional services, which I've highlighted here. Some of you might select construction and engineering, depending on the scope of your work. There's an information icon in there so you can read this, how these classification standards are defined, but that's for the most part, most of you are going to select professional services. So this question is important because the system will weight your answers based on the industry sector that you are selecting. And this is important because some ESG issues aren't financially material to certain industries. So the rating system is going to account for those materiality differences based on the industry that you pick. I want to emphasize this again. This is based on international and national performance standards across 69 different industries. We're talking about manufacturing, retail, pharmaceuticals, utility companies, financial sector. So it's a very broad, the performance standards are broadly applied to many, many industries. And obviously design firm companies have different business models than manufacturers and many of the other industries. So some of the questions as you're going through this might seem inapplicable, but answer them honestly, don't leave them blank, because you're going to have to trust that the tool is going to account for the industry you are actually working in. Okay, so I thought I'd give you this slide just to kind of give you a sense of the scope of the types of questions. Probably no surprises here. We've already talked about all of the topical areas. And then you can see here how many questions are associated with each of those areas. For climate risks, you're going to have 8 questions. Biodiversity, there's 1. And I won't read this whole list, but you can see kind of where the weight is. Dignity and equality, so how you're managing that in your firm. How you're managing health and safety issues with your firm. 8 questions. There's a big bucket of questions here, 12 for risk and opportunity oversight, 13 on your governance strategy, and then a significant number right here on supply chain. So you can see this is a very long assessment. Again, 115 questions. It could take you a few hours, it could take you an hour, or maybe it'll take you a day to complete over a certain amount of time. But let me tell you why this is important. So the comprehensiveness of the survey is for a very good reason. It's based on accepted international and national performance standards. So we want you to feel confident that the self-assessment you are going through is going to be a legitimate assessment of your ESG performance to help you understand, and also to help you understand what that scope of issues look like, what those opportunities you might want to focus on. Now, I know on this call right now, we have some very large firms joining us, and we have some mid-sized firms and some small firms. And I want you to know, small firms, this may not be for you because of the complexity of ESG, but you may still want to complete the self-assessment and score yourself and understand the scope of ESG risks and opportunities. Do not worry if you get a low score. It does not matter. It only matters to you to be able to see what those issues are, what those risks are, and how you are measuring up. This is your self-assessment. We, Victor, we will have no access to any of your answers. We won't see your score, nothing specific to you. And eventually, what we do hope is that we're going to have a significant number of insureds assessing themselves, and we'll have access to aggregated, anonymized data. And when we do, we will provide you benchmarking information so that we can help you see how you're performing against your peers based on size, based on headcount or region. And that's the only information we're going to have, nothing specific to you. I do want to make this quick side note on the small firm issue. Before we were launching, we actually had contemplated limiting this tool to larger firms. But we decided against that, and here's why. We felt that design firms of all sizes need to get ahead of ESG. We want you to understand it. So we purposely opened this tool up to all firms of all size because you deserve to know. I mean, if you can, obviously you can say, this is too much for you. I'm a small firm. I don't have the capacity to manage it. Totally fine. No judgment on our side. But we wanted you to have this available because you deserve to know how these risks are measured, because you are part of the value chain. Even if you're a smaller firm, you may be a part of these larger projects, right? And you will want to know how these risks are playing out for the entire project stakeholder value chain. So again, there's no risk to you, completely confidential. You can use it if you wish if you're a small firm. Okay, beyond format, let's discuss the sequence of questions. So the first 9 are demographic related questions. Again, industry, where you operate, your firm size, headcount. Again, this is just for eventually so that we can have aggregated data to be able to help you benchmark yourself and see how you measure up. The remaining questions, sort of the substance of the self-assessment. What the assessment is about, it's insight into how your company is managing and planning for all of the issues we just talked about, the climate risks, those environmental issues, how you're treating your employees or what policies and procedures you have in place for your employees, how you're upskilling your workforce or whether you're upskilling your workforce. Are you training them on ESG risks? Do you have protocols and procedures for managing ethical breaches? Do you have protocols and procedures for managing cybersecurity breaches? How do you engage with your customers and your project stakeholders and community? And then, of course, supply chain. What are your procurement policies and procedures? What do you have in place to manage those vulnerabilities? So I put this in the presentation because I wanted you to be aware that for our insureds, when and if you request a link to complete the ESG assessment for your firm, we're going to send you some guidance documents. One of the guidance documents, you can see this is just the cover page, but it'll have an appendix with a full list of questions so that if you want, you can review the questions ahead of time. You can share them with your colleagues. You'll also get, if you request a link to assess yourself, your colleagues within your firm can all work on that off of that one link. You can share it within your firm because there may be different people within your firm. Let's say HR, compliance, maybe you have a sustainability person on staff, but there's different components to this. So you'll be able to share that link. But my point on this slide is you'll have a full list of the questions in the guidance documents that we have produced for you. So here's a sample of that appendix. And I purposely took out this particular topic, the health and well-being topic, because this is about how you're managing health and safety. So here's some of the questions. So does the company have an occupational health and safety policy? That's sort of fundamental. Do you have that in place? Has your company adopted the ISO 45001 Occupational Health and Safety Management System or equivalent? So do you have some sort of external certification in place? Does the company have specific policies in place in the following areas? Hazard identification, health and well-being risk assessment, incident investigation. Has the company ever had any work-related injuries or fatalities in the last 3 years? Does the company facilitate employee access to non-occupational medical and healthcare services and/or voluntary health promotion services? And the list goes on and on. Things like how you're managing employee data protection laws. Do you have a flex work schedule for your employees? So this should give you a taste of how thorough this assessment really is, but also how your firm's performance in these areas can meaningfully reduce your claims exposures, which, by the way, is an attractive performance metric for those project stakeholders who are going to be inquiring about your ESG practices and how you manage your business to mitigate claims. So I encourage you to take a look at the appendix or the guidance document and take a look at the appendix and questions if you'd like. You don't have to, you can also just go straight into the self-assessment. The last note I wanted to point out is there are some really nice features that have been built into the product. There's an additional layer of resources like information icons. I took a screenshot of one of the questions. So does the organization have a supplier diversity program? Maybe you don't know what that is. If you hover over the information icon, it'll give you some information. It'll source it. Many of the questions also have hyperlinks. I don't have it on this slide, but you can click on the hyperlink. And what that does, it helps you have resources built into the product that can help you understand what those risks are and how to manage those risks. Okay, So once you've completed your self-assessment and you've done, you've completed it, you're ready to hit submit, your scorecard is going to come to you within 24 to 48 hours. So let's take a look at that assessment score. I'm going to have to get out of the PowerPoint here for just a second. Let's get out of it. All right, so hopefully you're seeing the scorecard. So what you're seeing here is a typical scorecard. It's a one-pager, so it's not long. You'll see the industry you selected. You're going to see your overall ESG score. And by the way, you are scored on a scale of 0 to 10. So a very low score, 0 to 2, a very high score, 8 to 10. So the more green you see, dark green you see on your performance scorecard, the higher you are scoring on ESG risk factors. Then, so it's not only going to give you your overall ESG score, it's also going to give you your score based on environmental risk factors, on social risk factors, and on governance. So you can see with this demo scorecard, this company scored very well on social risk factors, a little bit low, as you can see, because it's orange, on environmental risk factors, and a little bit low on governance risk factors. And then on the right side of your scorecard, you'll be able to see the themes and how you score based on the themes. Again, skills for the future. So you hover over skills for the future on your scorecard. You're going to be able to see, well, here's how I score. And because it's green, you know you scored well. And you might score low in other areas. You can see resource availability or other, a lot of yellow here. Not a bad thing, but it'll tell you your numerical value and it'll color code it for you as well. On this side of your performance scorecard, this is sort of just an explanation of the ESG risk rating tool. And then also, you're going to get information on how you score on those governance factors. So those controls, remember we talked about the reporting metrics, the resiliency strategies you have. You'll be able to see your scores, again, color-coded and numerical, based on controls, based on environmental, social. You can see this little matrix. And then on the right-hand side, you're going to see basically the scores you're getting on that governance framework, but you're going to see it, but you're going to actually have high-level recommendations included. So the tool is built to tell you, okay, on environmental, you did quite well on your controls, and perhaps you didn't do so well on reporting, or you don't report. So it's going to give you a little explanation on how you can improve those scores. All right, let's go back to the PowerPoint. There we go. Okay. All right, so let me just sort of summarize the benefits here and some of the things I forgot to mention earlier, so I'll summarize it here. So the first big issue here, or the big benefit, is you're going to get an ESG rating at no cost. Again, if you are a Victor CNA policyholder, no cost to you, and you'll be able to take the assessment multiple times. I'll talk about that. I think actually this is one of the more important benefits to the Victor ESG Risk Rating tool. It's going to de-risk your ESG journey because it is confidential. You don't want to learn what ESG risks look like from your client or from someone else. This is an opportunity for you to go through it yourself and learn how you're performing well and what you can do to improve if you have the capacity to improve. The other real big benefit is this is a digital data-driven approach. You won't have to calculate. You don't have to manually assess yourself. You can, within 24 to 48 hours of completing your assessment, receive this nice scorecard that will help you know how you're doing. I've already said this multiple times, but it is a credible scorecard based on credible performance standards. You can share this tool or your performance scorecard with stakeholders if you wish. You can put it on your website, you can share it with project stakeholders, you can use it to market if you want for prospecting, or you can not share it at all and you can just improve on it. And this is really important, and I'll talk about it in a second, but you can reassess yourself every 3 months if you wish. This is an opportunity for you to understand the scope of ESG risks. By virtue of going through this process and understanding what those risks look like, those emerging and future risks, you're going to build a more resilient business model. And eventually, we hope that we'll be able to help you benchmark yourself in the market. Positioning your firm competitively kind of goes without saying. You're learning by attending this webinar more than most people understand about the scope of ESG risks. So you will be a credible client advisor who, by the way, again, all industries are subject to these performance standards on ESG. So your clients, real estate developers, those funders, those financiers, you will be able to talk intelligently and at a sophisticated level about what ESG risks look like and how you are doing, what you are doing to connect the dots for them to improve those financial terms on projects. All right, I want to close with this. This is just a map to help you contextualize where you might be in your ESG journey. Some of you might be much further along, and that's great. And what we're hoping is that you are going to use the Victor Risk Rating tool to be your compass in this journey. So here we are today, we're having this webinar. When this webinar ends, you are going to get a survey. And in that survey, you'll have an opportunity, if you are a Victor CNA insured, you can ask for the ESG Risk Rating link. Just proactively tell us you want it. You will have to create a Victor website account. It's no big deal. I promise it takes 1 minute to do that. And we have instructions on how you'll be able to do that. But once you request an ESG Risk Rating link, we will send you that link, and you will also receive those guidance documents to kind of walk you through what I just talked about. You can self-assess yourself. Within 24 to 48 hours, you'll get your performance scorecard. The next step is you assessing whether you have the capacity or the resources based on your performance to kind of take some low-hanging fruit to improve your score. And then after 3 months or a year, whatever time frame works for you, you can request another ESG Risk Rating link. We do ask that you spread this out over 3 months. We think you at least need 3 months to improve those scores meaningfully. So once you request that link, again, we're now on the rinse and repeat kind of schedule. You can do it as many times as you'd like. We do have a dedicated page, a resource page on ESG. If you have any questions about anything I've talked about, or as you're going along in your self-assessment, you can email esgriskrating.us@victorinsurance.com. And it looks like I gave you 8 minutes back. That concludes today's webinar. I was more efficient than I thought I'd be in my delivery. I do hope this presentation provided you with some valuable insights. Most importantly, I hope that it has inspired you to take action and to use the Victor tool as your compass for managing ESG performance. I certainly appreciate the hour or almost hour you gave us today. I'll say bye for now, and I hope you have a great day.